The email arrived at 3 in the morning, and Sophie Reynolds should have been asleep. But insomnia had become her constant companion since her father's death, 6 months ago. She stared at her laptop screen, reading the message from an attorney in Boston about an inheritance she never expected. Her father had been a factory worker his entire life, living paycheck to paycheck, so the mention of property and assets made no sense. The lawyer requested her presence in Boston within the week to discuss matters that could not be handled over the phone or email. Sophie booked a flight the next morning, using the last of her savings from her job as a museum curator in Philadelphia. The position paid modestly, but she loved working with art and history, spending her days cataloging paintings and arranging exhibitions. Her small apartment was filled with prints of famous artworks and books about Renaissance painters, her true passion in life. The flight to Boston felt surreal, and she clutched the printed email in her hands, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of what her father might have left behind. The law office occupied the 20th floor of a gleaming building in the financial district. Sophie felt underdressed in her simple navy dress and cardigan, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits rushing through the marble lobby. The elevator ride made her stomach flutter with anxiety, and she checked her reflection in the polished doors, tucking a strand of light brown hair behind her ear. "Miss Reynolds." A young receptionist greeted her with a professional smile. "Mr. Harrison is ready for you." The attorney was a silver-haired man in his 60s who gestured for her to sit across from his massive mahogany desk. He opened a file folder and studied her for a moment before speaking. "Your father worked for Damian Industries for 35 years, Mr. Harrison began. He was employed at their manufacturing plant in Pennsylvania. What you may not know is that 20 years ago, he witnessed something that could have destroyed the company. Instead of going to the authorities or the press, he made an arrangement with the owner at the time, Marcus Damian." Sophie's hands trembled slightly. "What kind of arrangement?" "Your father signed a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for monthly payments that were deposited into a trust fund. He never touched the money. After his passing, the trust transfers to you, along with all accumulated interest. The amount is substantial, Miss Reynolds, just over $2 million. The room seemed to tilt. Sophie gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process the information. Her father had lived so modestly, working overtime shifts and clipping coupons, while $2 million sat untouched in an account somewhere. "What did he witness?" Sophie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrison's expression became guarded. "The NDA extends to you as the beneficiary. However, given the unusual circumstances, I can tell you that it involved a workplace accident that was covered up. Someone died, and the company buried the evidence to avoid liability. Your father was the only witness." Sophie felt sick. Her father had carried that secret his entire life, had taken money to stay silent about someone's death. It contradicted everything she thought she knew about him, the man who taught her about integrity and doing the right thing. "I don't want it," she said firmly. "The money feels wrong. Someone died and my father helped hide it." Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "That's your choice, but I'd encourage you to think carefully. Your father made a difficult decision in impossible circumstances. He had a young daughter to raise alone after your mother left. Marcus Damian has since passed away, and his son now runs the company. The statute of limitations has long expired on any criminal charges. The money cannot bring back whoever died, but it can change your life." Sophie left the office without signing anything, her mind spinning. She walked aimlessly through Boston streets, barely noticing the cold October wind or the crowds of people rushing past. She found herself near the waterfront, watching boats bob in the harbor, trying to reconcile the father she remembered with the man who had accepted blood money. Her phone rang, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer. "Miss Reynolds, this is Samuel Damian. I own Damian Industries. I heard about your meeting with my attorney today, and I'd like to speak with you in person if you're willing. I'm currently at my office on Newberry Street. I can send a car." His voice was deep and steady, with an edge of something she couldn't quite identify. Urgency, perhaps, or concern. "Why would you want to meet with me?" Sophie asked. "Because this situation involves my family's company, and I believe you deserve more answers than a lawyer can provide." "Please, Miss Reynolds, 1 hour of your time." Against her better judgment, Sophie agreed. A black town car arrived 15 minutes later, and the driver opened the door with practiced courtesy. The ride took them through elegant neighborhoods lined with brownstones and boutique shops. They stopped in front of a renovated historic building, and Sophie was escorted to the top floor. Samuel Damian's office was nothing like she expected. Instead of cold corporate sterility, the space felt warm and personal, with exposed brick walls, built-in bookshelves, and large windows overlooking the street below. Art hung on every available surface, not the generic corporate type, but real pieces that showed careful selection and genuine appreciation. He stood when she entered, and Sophie's breath caught slightly. Samuel Damian was probably in his early 30s, tall with dark hair and striking green eyes. He wore jeans and a gray sweater, his sleeves pushed up to his forearms. He looked more like a professor or an architect than a billionaire industrialist. "Thank you for coming," he said, extending his hand. His grip was warm and firm. "Please sit. Can I get you anything? Coffee, tea, water?" "I'm fine," Sophie replied, settling into a leather chair. "You said you could provide answers." Samuel sat across from her, his posture relaxed but his eyes intense. "My father was not a good man, Miss Reynolds. I've spent the last 8 years since taking over the company trying to undo the damage he caused. When I learned about your father's arrangement, I was appalled. I've been trying to find a way to make things right. You knew about the cover-up." "Not until 3 years ago, when I found documents while going through old company files. My father hid many things from me, kept me away from the operational side of the business until his death forced me to take control. When I discovered what happened 20 years ago, I hired investigators to learn the full truth." Samuel stood and retrieved a folder from his desk, handing it to Sophie. Inside were photographs, police reports, and investigative summaries. She read slowly, her stomach churning with each page. A young man named Robert Chen had died in a machinery accident at the Pennsylvania plant. He was 23 years old, newly married, with a baby on the way. Marcus Damian had paid off the local authorities, falsified safety reports, and threatened anyone who might talk. Sophie's father had been a supervisor on duty that night, and he had seen everything. "Why didn't my father go to the police later?" Sophie asked, tears burning her eyes. "Why keep silent?" "I've asked myself the same question," Samuel said quietly. "My investigators spoke with some of your father's former co-workers. They said Marcus threatened him, told him that if he talked, he'd make sure your father never worked again, that you'd end up in foster care. Your father was a single parent with no support system. My father exploited that vulnerability." Sophie wiped her eyes, angry at herself for crying in front of a stranger. What happened to Robert Chen's family? His widow remarried a few years later and moved to California. Their daughter is now in college. "I found them 2 years ago and set up a trust fund anonymously. It won't bring back her father, but she'll never have to worry about tuition or expenses." "Does she know the truth about how her father died?" Samuel's expression darkened. "No." I couldn't decide if telling her would bring closure or just inflict more pain. I'm still wrestling with that choice. Sophie studied him, this man who could have simply maintained his father's secrets, but instead chose to dig into painful history. Why tell me all of this? You could have let me take the money and disappear. Because you deserve to know who your father really was. He made a choice under duress, but he wasn't a villain. He protected his child the only way he knew how. And because I wanted you to understand that the money in that trust fund represents my family's debt, not your father's shame. They sat in silence for a long moment. Sophie looked around the office again, noticing details she had missed before. A photograph on the bookshelf showed a younger Samuel with an older man who must have been his father. Samuel looked uncomfortable in the picture, his smile forced. "Did you love him?" Sophie asked suddenly. "Your father," Samuel's jaw tightened. "I wanted to. I spent my whole childhood trying to earn his approval, to be the son he wanted. When I finally learned what kind of man he really was, I felt relieved that I'd failed to become like him." Something in his voice resonated with Sophie's own complicated feelings about her father. Love and disappointment could exist simultaneously, she was learning. "I work as a museum curator," Sophie said, surprising herself by sharing. "I spend my days with beautiful things created by people who have been dead for centuries. Sometimes I think I prefer history to the present because it's already happened. It can't hurt me anymore." "What kind of art do you work with?" "Renaissance paintings, mostly. I just finished cataloging a collection of Italian works from the 1500s. There's something profound about standing in front of a painting that someone created 500 years ago, knowing that artists hoped their work would outlive them. They wanted to be remembered." Samuel leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Do you think they'd be happy with how they're remembered? Or disappointed that we only see them through the lens of history, not as complete people?" "I think they'd be human about it, grateful and frustrated in equal measure. Like your father, I suppose. I'm sure he did things in his life besides cover up a death, but that's likely what he'll be remembered for now." "Unless we choose to remember him differently," Samuel said. "Unless we decide that people are more than their worst moments." Sophie found herself relaxing slightly, drawn into the conversation. They talked for another hour about art and history, about Boston and Philadelphia, about growing up with complicated parents. Samuel had studied business at his father's insistence, but had wanted to be an architect. He designed buildings in his spare time, creating intricate drawings that would never be constructed. "I'd like to see them sometime," Sophie said, then felt embarrassed by her forwardness. "If you ever wanted to share them, I mean." "I'd like that," Samuel replied, his smile genuine and warm. "Are you staying in Boston for a while?" "I have a hotel room for 2 nights. I need to get back to Philadelphia by Friday for work." "Have dinner with me tonight, please. Let me show you that not all Damians are morally compromised." Sophie knew she should decline, should maintain professional distance from this man connected to her father's darkest secret. But something about Samuel felt safe despite the circumstances, and she found herself wanting to know him better. "All right," she agreed. "Dinner." Samuel took her to a small Italian restaurant in the North End, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. The owner greeted Samuel like an old friend, seating them at a corner table with a view of the street. They ordered wine and pasta, and Sophie couldn't remember the last time she had felt this relaxed around someone new. "Tell me about your favorite painting," Samuel said, twirling spaghetti on his fork. Sophie didn't hesitate. "Botticelli's Primavera. I saw it in Florence during a college semester abroad. I stood in front of it for over an hour, just absorbing every detail. The flowers, the flowing fabric, the expressions on the faces. It's about renewal and growth, spring after a long winter. I think about it whenever I'm going through something difficult. What made you want to work with art? My father, actually. Sophie's voice softened. When I was little, he'd take me to the Philadelphia Museum of Art every Sunday. We couldn't afford much, but admission was free for residents on Sunday mornings. He'd sit on a bench while I explored, and afterward, we'd have lunch in the park and I'd tell him everything I'd seen. He made me feel like my excitement about paintings and sculptures mattered, like it was important. He sounds like he loved you very much. He did. That's what makes this so hard. The man who showed me beauty and encouraged my dreams was also the man who stayed silent about a death. How do I reconcile those two people? Samuel set down his fork, his green eyes serious. You don't have to reconcile them. You just have to accept that he was human, capable of both courage and fear, love and self-preservation. We all are. They lingered over dinner for hours, the restaurant gradually emptying around them. Sophie learned that Samuel had taken over Damian Industries at 24, unprepared and overwhelmed by the responsibility. He had spent the first 2 years simply trying to keep the company afloat while learning how everything worked. Once he felt confident, he started making changes, improving safety standards, increasing wages, and investigating his father's legacy. A lot of the old executives resigned, Samuel told her. They didn't like my approach, thought I was too soft. But the company is more profitable now than it was under my father, and our employee satisfaction scores have tripled. Turns out treating people well is actually good for business. Revolutionary concept, Sophie teased, and Samuel laughed. The sound of his laughter made something warm bloom in Sophie's chest. She hadn't expected to like Samuel Damian, hadn't expected to see him as anything other than the son of the man who had corrupted her father. But he was thoughtful and self-aware, carrying guilt for sins that weren't his while trying to build something better. Walking back to her hotel, the autumn air crisp and sharp, Samuel asked, "What will you do about the trust fund?" "I don't know yet. Part of me still wants to refuse it, but I keep thinking about Robert Chen's daughter. If you could help her without telling her the truth, maybe I can accept help without carrying shame." "Your father wanted you to have that money, Sophie. He never spent a cent of it because he was saving it for you. Whatever his reasons for making that deal, the result was that he provided for your future. That's love, even if the circumstances were complicated." They reached her hotel, a modest building near Copley Square. Sophie turned to face Samuel, suddenly reluctant to say goodnight. "Thank you for today," she said. "For being honest with me, for sharing what you knew. It helps somehow knowing the full story." "Can I see you tomorrow before you leave?" Samuel asked. "I know it's forward, and I understand if this is all too complicated, but I really enjoyed tonight." Sophie's practical side warned her to be cautious, to not get involved with someone so entangled in her father's past. But her heart, which had felt frozen since her father's death, was beginning to thaw. "I'd like that," she said. Samuel smiled, the expression transforming his face from handsome to absolutely captivating. "I'll pick you up at 10. Dress comfortably." He surprised her by taking her to the Boston Public Garden the next morning. They rented a swan boat and drifted around the lagoon, surrounded by fall foliage in brilliant shades of orange and red. Other couples and families occupied the nearby boats, and Sophie felt strangely normal, like she was just a woman spending time with an attractive man, not someone navigating a moral labyrinth. "I haven't been on one of these since I was a kid," Samuel admitted. "My mother used to bring me here before she got sick. She loved the gardens, spent hours sketching the plants and trees. When did she pass away?" "I was 12. Cancer. My father buried himself in work afterward, and I learned to be invisible." Boarding schools, summer camps, anything to keep me occupied and out of his way. Sophie reached across the small space between them and squeezed his hand. Samuel looked surprised but didn't pull away, his fingers curling around hers. After the boat ride, they walked through the garden, talking about everything and nothing. Samuel pointed out architectural details on surrounding buildings, explaining design principles and historical context. Sophie found herself fascinated by his passion, the way his whole demeanor changed when discussing something he loved. They had lunch at a cafe, then spent the afternoon at the Museum of Fine Arts. Sophie guided Samuel through the galleries, sharing stories about the artists and the history behind various pieces. She stopped in front of a Renaissance painting of the Madonna and Child, studying the delicate brushwork. "What do you see?" Samuel asked, standing close behind her. "Longing," Sophie said softly. "Look at Mary's expression. She's holding her child, but there's sadness in her eyes. She knows what's coming, the pain and loss, but she holds him anyway, loves him anyway. Sometimes I think that's what parenthood really is, loving someone so much that you'll endure anything for them, even when you know it will hurt. Is that how you feel about your father now, that he endured something painful to protect you?" Sophie nodded slowly. "I'm starting to understand it that way. I don't know if I can forgive the choice, but I can understand the motivation behind it." Samuel turned her gently to face him. "You're extraordinary, you know that. Most people would have taken the money without question or refused it in righteous anger. But you're trying to understand, to see all the shades of gray. That takes real strength." Standing in that quiet gallery, surrounded by centuries of artistic expression, Sophie felt something shift between them. This wasn't just gratitude or circumstantial connection. She was genuinely falling for Samuel Damian, attracted to his integrity and his willingness to face uncomfortable truths. "I don't want to go back to Philadelphia," Sophie admitted. "Then stay. A few more days. I'll show you my designs, take you to my favorite places in the city. We'll keep talking and figure this out together." Sophie knew she should be practical, should think about her job and responsibilities. But when Samuel looked at her with those intense green eyes, she found herself wanting to be impractical for once in her carefully ordered life. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." Sophie called her supervisor at the museum and requested a few personal days, citing family matters. It wasn't entirely a lie. She moved from her hotel to a small bed and breakfast in Beacon Hill that Samuel recommended, a charming townhouse with window boxes full of chrysanthemums. Over the next 4 days, Sophie and Samuel explored Boston together. He took her to his office late one evening and showed her his architectural drawings, detailed sketches of houses and public buildings that demonstrated real talent and vision. Sophie studied each one carefully, impressed by the thought he had put into every element. "Why don't you pursue this?" she asked. "You could hire someone to run the company while you study architecture." "I've thought about it," Samuel admitted. "But I feel responsible for the people who work for Damian Industries. My father damaged a lot of lives, and I'm trying to repair that damage. Maybe once I feel like I've done enough, I can walk away and do what I actually want." "How will you know when you've done enough?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know if I ever will. That's the problem with trying to atone for someone else's sins. There's no clear end point, no moment when you can say the debt is fully paid." They were sitting on the floor of his office, their backs against the leather couch, architectural drawings spread around them. Sophie shifted closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "Maybe the point isn't to fully pay a debt that was never yours to begin with. Maybe it's about choosing to be different, to build something better. You've already done that, Samuel. You've changed the company culture, helped Robert Chen's daughter, and been honest with me when you could have hidden everything. That matters. Samuel turned his head, his lips close to her temple. You matter. These past few days with you have felt more real than anything has in years. I know the timing is complicated and the circumstances are unusual, but I don't want this to end when you go back to Philadelphia. Sophie's heart raced. What are you saying? I'm saying that I'm falling for you, Sophie Reynolds. I know it's fast, and I know we have a lot to figure out, but I can't pretend this is just casual. You've made me think about my life differently, made me want things I'd given up on. Sophie lifted her head to look at him directly. I'm falling for you too. It terrifies me because I came to Boston expecting answers about money and my father's choices, not expecting to meet someone who would make me feel this way. But here we are. Samuel cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. Here we are, he echoed, and then he kissed her. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative and questioning. But when Sophie responded, winding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something that felt inevitable and right. They kissed until they were breathless, until the sketches scattered beneath them were crumpled and forgotten. Stay in Boston, Samuel murmured against her lips. Move here. I know it's a huge ask, but I can't imagine going back to my life without you in it. Sophie wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to throw caution aside and leap into this relationship with both feet, but her practical nature reasserted itself. I have a career in Philadelphia, an apartment, a life. I can't just abandon everything on impulse. Not impulse, Samuel corrected. Choice. A deliberate choice to see where this could go. I'm not asking you to give up your career. I'll help you find a position at a museum here, or I can fund your research if you want to write about art. Whatever you need, we'll figure it out together. That's too much. I can't let you support me. Samuel pulled back slightly, his expression serious. Sophie, I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. My father might have been corrupt, but he was good at making money, and I've continued that success while trying to use the wealth more responsibly. Helping the woman I'm falling in love with pursue her passion isn't charity, it's partnership. The woman I'm falling in love with. The words made Sophie's breath catch. I need time to think, she said finally. This is all happening so fast, and I don't want to make a decision I'll regret. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere. Sophie returned to Philadelphia the next day, her mind in turmoil. Her apartment felt small and lonely after days in Samuel's company. She went back to work at the museum, cataloging a new acquisition of Baroque paintings, but her heart wasn't in it. She kept thinking about Samuel's architectural drawings, about his intensity when discussing design principles, about the way he kissed her like she was precious. They talked every night, long phone conversations that stretched past midnight. Samuel told her about his day, about problems at the company and designs he was working on. Sophie shared stories about the museum and the colleagues who were starting to notice her distraction. My friend Jennifer thinks I met someone in Boston, Sophie said one evening, curled up on her couch with her phone pressed to her ear. She says I have that look. What look? Samuel asked, and she could hear the smile in his voice. The look of someone falling in love. She's a romantic, reads novels with shirtless men on the covers and believes in fate. Is she right? Are you falling in love with me? Sophie closed her eyes, admitting the truth to herself and to him. Yes, I'm terrified and uncertain about the logistics, but yes, I'm falling in love with you. Then come back to Boston. This weekend. Let me show you what life could look like here. Sophie booked a flight for Friday evening. Samuel picked her up at the airport, pulling her into his arms the moment she cleared security. He kissed her in front of hundreds of travelers, and Sophie didn't care who saw. He had planned an entire weekend to convince her to move. Saturday morning, he took her to interview at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, where a curator position had recently opened. The director seemed impressed by Sophie's credentials and her enthusiasm for Renaissance art. She didn't promise Sophie the job, but she indicated that a formal offer would likely follow. That afternoon, Samuel drove her around various Boston neighborhoods, pointing out apartments and areas she might like. They explored Cambridge and Somerville, Brookline and Jamaica Plain, discussing the pros and cons of each location. "You don't have to decide where to live right now," Samuel said as they sat in a coffee shop in Harvard Square. "You could stay with me while you look for a place. I have plenty of space." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "We've known each other for 2 weeks, Samuel. Moving in together might be rushing things." "Fair point, but the offer stands whenever you're ready." Sunday morning they drove to Cape Cod. The beach was nearly empty, the summer tourists long gone. They walked along the shore, waves crashing nearby, and Samuel talked about his mother again. "She brought me here every summer," he said, picking up a smooth stone and turning it over in his palm. "We'd rent a cottage for a week, just the two of us. She'd paint watercolors while I built sandcastles. Those are my best memories of childhood." "You still have her paintings?" "Some of them. My father threw most away after she died, said they were cluttering the house. I managed to save a few, hid them in my room. They're in storage now. I couldn't bring myself to hang them, but I couldn't let them go either." Sophie took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Show them to me someday. When you're ready." They sat on the beach as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Samuel wrapped his arm around Sophie's shoulders and she leaned into his warmth. "I've made a decision," Sophie said quietly. "I'm going to accept the trust fund money, and I'm going to use part of it to research what happened to my father's co-workers from that night to see if any of them need help. My father stayed silent, but that doesn't mean I have to." "That's incredibly generous. It feels right. And I think my father would approve in his way. He was a good man who made a hard choice. I can honor both truths." "What about us?" Samuel asked, his voice careful. "Have you made a decision about that?" Sophie turned to face him, her heart full of certainty despite the practical complications. "I'm going to apply for the position at the Gardner Museum. If they offer it to me, I'll move to Boston. And I'm going to see where this relationship goes because you make me happier than I've been in a long time. But we're taking it at a reasonable pace. No moving in together immediately, no rushing through the important steps." Samuel's grin was brilliant. "I can work with reasonable pacing, as long as the end goal is us together." "That's the goal," Sophie confirmed and kissed him as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The job offer came 3 weeks later. Sophie gave notice at her Philadelphia museum, packed up her apartment, and moved to Boston in early December. She found a 1-bedroom in Brookline, close enough to the Gardner Museum for an easy commute. Samuel helped her move, carrying boxes and assembling furniture with an endearing determination to be useful. "I'm not naturally handy," he admitted, staring at instructions for a bookshelf. "I can design buildings, but apparently I can't put together IKEA furniture." Sophie laughed and took over the assembly while Samuel organized her books on the completed shelves. She watched him alphabetize by author, his focus absolute, and felt a wave of affection so strong it almost hurt. They fell into a rhythm over the following months. Sophie threw herself into her new position, curating an exhibit about Venetian painters. Samuel continued running Damian Industries while working on his architectural designs in spare moments. They had dinner together several nights a week, exploring Boston's restaurant scene. On weekends, they visited museums and galleries, walked the Freedom Trail, attended concerts and plays. Sophie met Samuel's friends, mostly people he had known since college who seemed genuinely happy to see him in a relationship. They welcomed Sophie warmly, sharing embarrassing stories about Samuel's younger years. He once spent an entire semester designing a treehouse for his architecture class. A friend named Michael told her over drinks. The professor thought he was crazy, but Samuel insisted that residential design principles applied to all structures, regardless of size. He got an A. Of course he did, Sophie said fondly, watching Samuel argue with another friend about the merits of brutalist architecture. Samuel met Sophie's small circle of Philadelphia friends when they came to visit. Jennifer, the romantic who had first noticed Sophie's change, pulled her aside. "He's perfect for you," Jennifer whispered. "The way he looks at you, like you're the most fascinating person in the room. Don't let this one go." "I don't plan to," Sophie assured her. 4 months into their relationship, Samuel took Sophie to dinner at an upscale restaurant overlooking the harbor. She wore a deep blue dress that Samuel had complimented the first time he saw it, and he wore a suit that made him look sophisticated and successful. Over dessert, Samuel reached across the table and took her hand. "I need to tell you something, and I want you to just listen until I'm finished." Sophie's stomach fluttered with nervousness. "Okay. I told you about finding documents that revealed what my father did, how I spent years trying to make amends. What I didn't tell you is why I became so obsessed with uncovering the truth. 3 years ago, I was engaged to a woman named Victoria. We'd been together since college, and everyone assumed we'd get married and have the perfect society life. But Victoria only cared about money and status. When I started making changes at the company, prioritizing ethics over maximum profit, she hated it. She thought I was weak, throwing away my father's legacy for nothing." Samuel paused, his thumb rubbing circles on Sophie's palm. "We had a massive fight when I insisted on investigating the old workplace accidents. She told me I was being stupid, that I should just accept that my father cut corners and move on. I realized then that I didn't love her anymore, maybe never really had. I broke off the engagement, and she told everyone I'd lost my mind. That grief over my father's death had made me unstable." "I'm sorry," Sophie said softly. "That must have been painful." "It was, but it also freed me. I stopped caring what people in my father's social circle thought. I sold the family estate and moved into a normal apartment. I cut ties with anyone who couldn't accept the changes I was making. And I accepted that I might be alone, because finding someone who understood what I was trying to do seemed impossible." Samuel's green eyes were intense as he looked at her. "Then I met you, Sophie. You walked into my office angry and grieving, demanding answers about your father, and I saw someone who cared about truth even when it was ugly. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You see me, not the billionaire or the company or the baggage, just me." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Sophie's breath caught. "I know it's only been 6 months," Samuel continued. "I know some people will say it's too fast, but I've never been more certain of anything. I love you, Sophie Reynolds. I love your passion for art, your thoughtfulness, your ability to see shades of gray in complicated situations. I love how you make me want to be better, to keep fighting to build something worthwhile. Will you marry me?" He opened the box, revealing a vintage ring with a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. It was elegant and unique, exactly what Sophie would have chosen for herself. Tears streamed down Sophie's face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply while the other restaurant patrons applauded. Sophie laughed against his lips, happier than she'd ever imagined possible. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the Boston Public Garden, the place where they'd rented swan boats and talked about art and pain and complicated parents. Sophie wore a simple ivory dress with lace sleeves, and Samuel wore a charcoal suit with a blue tie that matched her engagement ring. Jennifer served as maid of honor, crying through the entire ceremony. Michael was Samuel's best man, making a toast about how Sophie had transformed his previously workaholic friend into someone who actually took vacations and smiled regularly. Instead of a traditional reception, they hosted an intimate dinner for 30 people at the Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date. The owner brought out special dishes and vintage wine, delighting in playing host to their celebration. Sophie's father wasn't there to walk her down the aisle, but she carried a handkerchief that had belonged to him, tucked into her bouquet. She had made peace with his choices, understanding that love sometimes meant making impossible decisions. The trust fund money had allowed her to help 3 of his former co-workers who had been injured on the job over the years, providing medical bill assistance and living expenses. It felt like honoring both her father's sacrifice and the truth he'd helped conceal. For their honeymoon, Samuel surprised Sophie with a trip to Italy. They spent 2 weeks in Florence, Rome, and Venice, visiting every museum and gallery they could find. Sophie stood in front of Primavera again, Samuel's hand in hers, and felt the full weight of her journey from grief and confusion to love and certainty. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, studying her profile as she gazed at Botticelli's masterpiece. "That I'm grateful for the path that brought me here, even though parts of it were painful. My father's secret led me to you, and Robert Chen's death, as tragic as it was, became part of our story. We can't change the past, but we can choose what we build from it." "We've built something pretty incredible," Samuel said, pulling her close, "and we're just getting started." Back in Boston, they settled into married life with surprising ease. Sophie continued her work at the Gardner Museum, eventually becoming head curator. She organized groundbreaking exhibits that drew international attention, combining her passion for Renaissance art with innovative presentation techniques. Samuel made a major decision a year after their wedding. He hired a CEO to run Damian Industries, someone with impeccable ethics who shared his vision for the company. With the day-to-day operations in capable hands, Samuel enrolled in architecture school, finally pursuing his true passion. "Are you sure about this?" Sophie asked as he prepared for his first day of classes. "You're going to be studying with people 10 years younger." "I've never been more sure of anything except marrying you," Samuel replied, kissing her forehead. "Life's too short to keep putting off what makes you happy." Sophie found his designs scattered around their apartment, sketches of houses and buildings growing more sophisticated as his skills developed. She'd frame the ones she particularly loved, hanging them on the walls alongside prints of famous paintings. 2 years into their marriage, Sophie discovered she was pregnant. They announced it over dinner with friends, and Jennifer immediately started planning a baby shower. Samuel was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, reading parenting books and designing nursery furniture with obsessive attention to detail. Their daughter was born on a snowy January morning, healthy and perfect. They named her Claire, after Samuel's mother. Sophie held the tiny bundle in her arms, overwhelmed by love and the weight of responsibility. "She's so small," Samuel whispered, gently touching Claire's miniature hand. "How do we keep something this precious safe?" "We do our best and love her unconditionally," Sophie said. "Like our parents did, with all their flaws and complicated choices. We're going to make mistakes too, but we'll do it with good intentions." Samuel kissed Sophie's temple, then his daughter's forehead. "I promise to always be honest with her about my father, about where our family's money came from. She deserves to know the truth and make her own choices about how to carry that legacy. We'll tell her together when she's old enough to understand, Sophie agreed. Watching Samuel with their daughter over the following months, Sophie saw the kind of father he had always wanted to be. He was patient and gentle, singing off key lullabies and walking endless circles around their living room at 3 in the morning. He balanced school and parenthood with the same dedication he brought to everything meaningful in his life. When Claire was 6 months old, Sophie and Samuel took her to visit the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They stood in front of paintings with Claire in Samuel's arms, telling her about colors and composition even though she was far too young to understand. "Think she'll love art like her mother?" Samuel asked. "Or architecture like her father? Or something completely different?" "As long as she's passionate about something, I'll be happy." They had a second child 2 years later, a son they named James. Their apartment became too small for a family of 4. So Samuel designed their dream home, a beautiful house in Brookline with large windows, built-in bookshelves, and a studio where Sophie could work on research projects. The house took a year to build, with Samuel obsessively checking every detail of the construction. When they finally moved in, Sophie walked through each room feeling grateful for the life they had created together. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Sophie and Samuel returned to the Cape Cod beach where he had proposed moving to Boston. Their children played in the sand, building elaborate castles while their parents watched from a nearby blanket. "You ever regret it?" Sophie asked. "Taking on your father's company, dealing with all that guilt and responsibility?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "I regret that it was necessary. I wish my father had been a better man, that Robert Chen hadn't died, that your father hadn't been forced into an impossible situation. But I don't regret what came after, the choices I made to try to fix things. Those choices led me to you." "My father's secret led me to you too," Sophie reflected. "If he hadn't taken that money, if the trust fund hadn't existed, I never would have gone to Boston. We never would have met." "Do you think he'd approve of us?" Sophie smiled, watching her children laugh as a wave splashed their feet. "I think he'd be grateful that something good came from his choice, that the burden he carried for all those years ultimately gave me this happiness. And I think he'd like you, Samuel. You're a good man trying to do right by people. That would have mattered to him." Samuel pulled her close, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sparkle on the water. Claire ran over, her hands full of shells she had collected. "Mama, look, pretty." Sophie admired each shell with genuine interest, helping Claire arrange them by size and color. Samuel lifted James onto his shoulders, carrying him down to the water's edge. That evening, after the children were asleep in their hotel room, Sophie and Samuel walked on the beach under the stars. They talked about Samuel's upcoming graduation from architecture school, about Sophie's plans for a major exhibit on female Renaissance artists, about their future together. "I want to tell you something," Samuel said, stopping to face her. "I've been working on a project secretly for the past year. Remember Robert Chen's daughter? I've stayed in contact with her anonymously through the trust fund administrator. She's graduating college next year and wants to be a social worker. I've arranged for her to have a job at a nonprofit I'm funding, one that helps families affected by workplace accidents. She'll never know it's connected to her father's death, but it feels like the right kind of legacy." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "That's beautiful, Samuel. Your father would never have done something like that." "No, he wouldn't have. But I'm not my father, and I refuse to let his choices define what our family stands for. We get to write our own story." "And what a story it is," Sophie said, kissing him softly. Years passed, full and rich with love and growth. Samuel's architecture firm took off, designing innovative residential buildings that prioritized sustainability and community. Sophie became internationally recognized for her work curating Renaissance art, publishing several books that became standard texts in art history courses. Their children grew into curious, compassionate people. Claire developed a passion for music, playing violin with impressive skill. James loved mathematics and science, building intricate machines from household items. Both children knew the story of their grandfather, the choices he had made, and the consequences that followed. Samuel and Sophie were honest about the complexity of their family history, teaching their children that people could make mistakes and still deserve love. When Claire was 16, she asked about the trust fund money and what had happened to Robert Chen's family. Sophie told her everything, including how her father had helped Chen's daughter anonymously. "You think we should tell her the truth?" Claire asked. "She deserves to know." "That's something your father and I have discussed many times," Sophie admitted. "We've never found a clear answer." "What do you think?" Claire considered it seriously. "I think the truth is always better than secrets, even when it's painful. But I also think it depends on what she wants. Maybe you could reach out and ask if she wants to know more about her father's death, without initially revealing the connection." It was wise advice from someone so young. Samuel took it, contacting Chen's daughter, now a 38-year-old woman named Lisa, through the trust fund administrator. She responded immediately, saying she had always wondered about the anonymous benefactor who had changed her life. Samuel and Sophie met Lisa at a cafe in San Francisco, where she lived. She was petite and kind-faced, with her father's eyes. Samuel was nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he stirred his coffee. "I'm Samuel Damian," he began. "My father owned the company where your father worked. I need to tell you about how your father died." Lisa listened intently as Samuel explained everything: the accident, the cover-up, Marcus Damian's threats and bribes, Sophie's father's silence. He took full responsibility for his family's role, even though he had been a child when it happened. When he finished, Lisa was quiet for a long moment. Tears streamed down her face, but her expression was thoughtful rather than angry. "I always knew there was more to the story," she said finally. "The official reports never made sense. My mother would change the subject whenever I asked questions. After she died 5 years ago, I thought I'd never learn the truth." "I'm so sorry," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father deserved better. You deserved better. You were just a kid when this happened," Lisa pointed out, "and you've spent your adult life trying to make it right. The trust fund, the job you helped me get, all the opportunities I've had because of that anonymous support. That was you. I couldn't bring your father back, but I could try to give you the life he would have wanted for you." Lisa reached across the table and took Samuel's hand. "Thank you for telling me the truth. And thank you for caring when you didn't have to. You're nothing like your father." That meeting brought Samuel a sense of peace he hadn't realized he was still seeking. He and Lisa stayed in touch, developing a genuine friendship. She became an advocate for workplace safety reform, using her father's story to push for stronger regulations and protections. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Sophie and Samuel renewed their vows in the same garden where they had married. Their children stood beside them, Claire playing violin while James read a poem he had written. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, including Lisa and her partner, Jennifer and her husband, and many others whose lives had been touched by their love and generosity. 15 years ago, I stood here and promised to love you for the rest of my life," Samuel said, holding Sophie's hands. "I've kept that promise every single day. You've made me better, braver, and happier than I ever imagined possible. Here's to 15 more years and beyond." When I came to Boston looking for answers about my father's past, I never expected to find my future, Sophie said, tears in her eyes. You showed me that complicated legacies don't have to define us, that we can build something beautiful from painful truths. I love you more today than I did on our wedding day, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. They kissed as their children cheered and their friends applauded, celebrating not just their marriage but everything they had built together, a family rooted in honesty, a legacy transformed from shame to service, and a love that had grown deeper with every challenge they faced. That evening, after the celebration ended and the children were in bed, Sophie and Samuel sat on their back porch, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness. You ever think about that first day? Sophie asked, leaning against Samuel's shoulder. When I walked into your office ready to refuse the money and leave Boston forever, all the time, I think about how different my life would be if you had walked away. The loneliness I'd accepted as permanent, the guilt I carried alone. I think about my father sometimes and wonder if he somehow knew, if he made that choice not just to protect me when I was young but to eventually lead me to you. That sounds foolish, I know. Not foolish, Samuel said softly. Hopeful, and hope is never foolish. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands as they had on a beach years ago. Two people who had found each other through secrets and sorrow and had chosen to build something better. Their children slept peacefully inside, growing up in a home filled with love and truth. Robert Chen's daughter was helping other families avoid the tragedy hers had suffered. Damian Industries operated with ethics and integrity, employing thousands with fair wages and safe conditions. The past could not be changed, but it could be honored and learned from. Sophie had learned her father's dark secret, had wrestled with her feelings about his choices, and had ultimately found that understanding and forgiveness could coexist with disappointment. She had learned Samuel's family history, the corruption and cover-ups, and had seen how one man could work tirelessly to transform a legacy of shame into something worthwhile. Most importantly, she had learned that love could grow from unlikely beginnings, that the deepest connections often emerged from the most complicated circumstances. Her love for Samuel had indeed grown deeper with every revelation, every shared truth, every challenge they faced together. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That we did it. We took broken pieces and built something whole. That's what love is, I think. Not just the romance and passion, though we have that, but the daily choice to face hard truths together, to carry each other's burdens, to build something that honors the past while reaching toward the future." Samuel kissed her temple, a gesture of tenderness that had become their trademark. "You make everything make sense, Sophie. Even the painful parts feel meaningful when you're beside me." They remained on the porch until the fireflies disappeared and the stars filled the sky. Two people who had found their way to each other through secrets and truth, who had built a life that honored both the light and the shadows. Their story wasn't simple or perfect, but it was real and deeply theirs, a testament to the transformative power of love, honesty, and the courage to face the past while building toward the future. Inside, their children dreamed peacefully, growing up in a home where truth was valued and mistakes were opportunities for growth. They would carry forward the lessons their parents had learned, that complicated legacies could be transformed, that honesty was always worth the difficulty, and that love deepened not despite challenges, but because of how those challenges were faced together. And in Boston, in San Francisco, in the towns where Damian Industries operated and the galleries where Sophie's work was displayed, the ripples of their choices continued to spread. A woman whose father had died decades ago now helped others heal. Workers came home safely to their families each night. Students studied art with new understanding because of innovative exhibits. A company that had valued profit over people now exemplified ethical business practices. One man's dark secret and another man's guilt had transformed into something beautiful, not because the past was erased or forgotten, but because two people chose to face it honestly and build something better from the ruins. Sophie Reynolds Damian and Samuel Damian had taken their complicated histories and woven them together into a love story that proved redemption was possible, that truth could coexist with compassion, and that the deepest love often grew from the deepest understanding. Their story continued, full of ordinary moments and extraordinary grace, a reminder that the best love stories aren't the ones without complications, but the ones where complications are faced together with courage, honesty, and unwavering commitment. And they lived that truth every day, building their happily ever after one honest, loving moment at a time.